Justin, how do you actually spend EuroDollars?
EuroDollar is one of the shittiest names that have ever been created. Instead of EuroDollar, change it to synthetic dollar. You could also argue offshore dollar, but I think synthetic dollar makes more sense. Josh, let me explain how this works to you. Let's start with the basics. If you have a $100 bill and you put it into the bank, and let's say you bank in the United States with Chase or whoever, right? You would say, I have $100 in the bank. And the answer is no, not quite. Oh, you got behind the dumpster at Wendy's today, Josh. Anyways, the point is that when you put that $100 into your bank, you would say, I have $100 in the bank. That's not actually correct. You actually have a $100 IOU from the bank, whether it's Chase, your credit union, whatever. The same thing applies to offshore banks. That's just a very fancy way of saying banks that aren't under the purview of the Fed. So large, small, medium-sized, whatever, international banks. So think CIBC if you're a Canadian, think Standard Chartered if you're a Brit, or Aussie, Montezuma, whatever. These financial institutions will take dollar-denominated deposits and in return give you a slip, or rather a slip, just a note when you log onto your bank account or whatever, right, that says, hey, listen, BMO or whatever, right, owes a Canadian depositor, $100 US or whatever, right? So that's the first concept. You have the actual cash, that bill you held up, and then when you change it into a bank deposit, you really have an IOU from a bank. Synthetic dollars. Now, let me say that in English or whatever, right? Let's say that you have a credit card with Chase or a debit card with Chase. You go to the grocery store and you buy $25 worth of hair products. Probably more, but let's just keep it at 25. And you swipe your credit card. And let's say that, Kroger, whatever grocery store you're at, let's say they bank with Bank of America. So what will really happen then is that, no, you're not spending any cash in the transaction. It's just electronic. What's going on behind the scenes is that the Bank of America account that Kroger is using will be credited by Bank of America with an additional $25. But then what will happen is that Bank of America will say, we've given Kroger 25 synthetic dollars that we, Bank of America, have issued. And the reason we're going to be made whole by that is because Chase owes us 25 synthetic dollars. Why Chase? Because you bank with Chase and you're the one that basically said, okay, listen, I want to spend this at the grocery store. And so therefore Chase will need to send over these synthetic dollars to Bank of America. This is where you have to be really, really precise. I use the word send over. That's not necessarily the best way to think about it. Rather, what goes on is this. Bank of America says, okay, well, listen, Chase theoretically owes us $25. And Chase will say, yeah, we theoretically owe Bank of America $25. And they might settle up maybe once a week, once a month, once a quarter. And instead of $25, it could be, $100, $100 million. I don't know if we get to the billions, but whatever, right? But there'll be some netting process. And then at the end of the day, the banks will get together and say, okay, well, look, your customers spent, 100 million over here, but our customers spent 110 million over there. So at the end of the day, we're just going to send over $10 million of some other asset, in order to balance the books whenever regular basis.
That other asset would be called collateral. And you'll hear this in every single conversation in macro, that collateral is what is backing the financial system. And that is the second part of every single one of these transactions. We're just saying that.
But it's really important. But here's the thing. The collateral only gets remitted if the banks actually settle up. And the banks just basically kind of keep it rolling on and on and on and on and on. This is the balance sheet expansion, because what's going to happen is that Bank of America is going to say, okay, well, listen, we haven't called Chase for the $25 that Josh spent, or, the $100 that Justin spent, or whatever, right? Bank of America might say, Chase owes us, $100 million, $250 million, $500 million. But at the same time, we, that is Bank of America, also owe Chase $500 million. And if these things are basically in balance, we'll just kind of kick the can. I mean, we might not let it get beyond certain parameters or whatever, right?
So in that example, Chase and Bank of America have been doing business with each other for many, many years. They have a trusted counterparty relationship, and they are completely fine netting whenever they want. Whenever one of them says, hey, you know what? Why don't you give me some money? We'll offset now. That is completely fine because they have that relationship. The issue comes in is when you have 100 of these other banks transacting with each other that are then putting on that third and fourth derivatives with other banks. And that is where counterparty risk comes in.
Yeah. And the other thing that goes in too is that Bank of America and Chase might say, listen, not only do we know each other, but we also have kind of an understanding of what's on each other's balance sheet. Like we know that, for example,
I would
Bank of America.
that. themselves don't even know it's on their own balance sheets.
Yeah, but hold on, let me explain, because I'm going to get there in just a second, Josh. You're getting ahead of me. So let's say I'm Bank of America and you're Chase or whatever, right? I might say, okay, well, listen, at the end of the day, we each have like a $500 million deficit we owe to the other, but just in case, you, let's say Chase, suddenly blow up, me, Bank of America, well, I also know you have a bunch of other assets on your book. Like, this is the collateral that you mentioned, that can come on over. Now, the other thing I want to note in all of this is that I use the concept of synthetic dollars to begin with. And so when banks are doing this, that 500 million that you owe me, or that Chase owes Bank of America, and let's say the 510 million that Bank of America owes Chase, whatever, right? This is all just on a balance sheet, and the balance sheet's just grown larger and larger and larger and larger and larger. You know how Manarino says they always have to issue more debt into the system. This is the practical implication of this happening in real life. Going back to the EuroDollar system, or perhaps better said, the offshore dollar system, that is banks that are under the purview of the Fed, that would be like the equivalent of, let's say, like a Société Générale, a French bank, issuing IOU dollars to Standard Chartered, or like an American bank or whatever, right? They might have a corresponding banking relationship, and through some technical jargon, meaning nostro vostro accounts, whatever, right? They might have some collateral that's put up. But again, at the same time too, just like in a Chase and Bank of America example, you might have an offshore and an onshore bank doing the same thing. Okay, well, look, we owe, Society, that is Bank of America owes Société Générale, I don't know, like $1 trillion, but Société Générale owes, Bank of America $1 trillion or whatever, right? But again, you have the balance sheet expansion. Let's talk about Contagion. Let's talk about Lehman Brothers, and let's talk about the great paranoia and the justifiable paranoia when the system freezes up.
So talking about Contagion in this situation, we are still having that same example, but the balance sheet continues to grow. So let's say Bank of America and Chase, they have not yet netted the position because they trust each other. Everything's going good. They both have a 500 million net debit that they owe each other. But then what happens if counterparty risk gets brought into the equation along with Contagion? So let's just say, as a simple example for now, Société Générale, a massive bank, goes bust. And now all of these other banks that have net debits with each other, let's say Chase has a 500 million debit that they have to owe 100 different banks, and 100 different banks owe 500 million to Chase. It would net overall, but now everybody sees intrinsic counterparty risk with all of their peers, and nobody wants to do business. So everybody says you need to cough up collateral, and they all are searching for the most pristine collaterals in the market. And we can see stuff like this happening today with T-bills that are super short duration and extreme need and desire that are wildly under reverse repo, which means reverse repo should put a floor on T-bills, because that is the way that you can get the safest T-bills in the world. But we see that T-bills are actually wildly below that supposed floor.
And this is where you get back into the contagion problem, because when banks no longer trust other banks, they're not willing to basically turn like $100 million to let it float to 250, to let it float to 500, and so on and so forth. They're going to say, whoa, wait a minute, we want to be paid back, and we want to be paid back now. But at the end of the day, and this is why the EuroDollar, or the synthetic dollar system, is such a hard thing for people to wrap their mind around, is that there's no real collateral in the system besides confidence. Another thing to point out too is that, let's say that you're a large multinational company, Josh, operating, let's say you're a large multinational UK company or whatever, right? You go to Standard Chartered or whatever, right? Or NatWest, and you say, I want a $100 million loan, but I want it denominated in USD. NatWest says, no problem. Josh, here you go. We will issue Josh Corp $100 million. And in doing so, they issue 100 million synthetic dollars. EuroDollars would be the technical term, but essentially synthetic dollars. It's a claim on a dollar that NatWest is willing to honor. But that claim will trade on a one-to-one basis with all of the other peers in the banking system. So if Josh Corp, right, wants to go and spend, buy something from, let's say, an Indonesian supplier or whatever, right? The Indonesian bank will basically say, okay, well, listen, Josh Corp wants to make a $100 million purchase with its $100 million loan that it got from a UK bank. And that means that you've got to spend $100 million for some Indonesian firm, and that Indonesian firm will do business with an Indonesian bank. So when you make your $100 million purchase from that Indonesian firm, what's really going on behind the scenes is their bank, that is the Indonesian bank, is crediting to that Indonesian firm 100 million synthetic dollars. So in other words, that Indonesian bank is saying, okay, listen, you now, that is the Indonesian firm, have a claim for 100 million synthetic dollars that we have created. At the same time, that Indonesian bank says, okay, well, listen, NatWest, you owe us 100 million synthetic dollars. And likewise, there might be some other business going back in the other direction. But that is actually how the money synthetically, in this case dollars, gets created by you taking out the loan in the UK. And so from the NatWest perspective, they say, okay, well, listen, Josh owes us $100 million, so that's the asset. The liability are the synthetic dollars they created, and that not only they created, but they also now owe to the Indonesian bank, because the Indonesian bank has created a liability, which is the asset of the company in Indonesia you want to do the purchasing from. I'm glad this is so easy and simple to explain and understand. What could possibly go wrong?
Yeah. Let's tie this back into how a bank actually goes bust, because I think that is vitally important. Justin said one of the most important lines earlier, that everything is about perceived counterparty risk. And that is the only way a bank can go bust. It does not matter what is on your balance sheet, because I can guarantee you these massive banks have absolutely no clue what is truly on their balance sheet, because there's no way to track it. And if the banks don't know what's on their balance sheet, how the F would the Federal Reserve know what's on their balance sheet when the banks themselves have no clue? So how does a bank actually go bust? All we need is every other bank to collectively agree that they don't want to do business with that bank. They could have the best balance sheet in the world. They could be super strong, but the way that the financial system works is every single transaction that is done, a bank transfers over their dollar liabilities onto another bank, and that bank has to agree to take those liabilities. If that Indonesian bank didn't want to take those dollar liabilities from Josh Corp's bank, then that transaction would not be done. And that's how a bank is forcefully shut down.
Yeah, and just to be very clear, they might not even take the collateral. They might say, okay, listen, Josh Bank or whatever, right? We know that you're good for it, so we're just going to expand the balance sheet. So we're not going to demand collateral, but we'll just say, oh, we've got this receivable. We have this IOU from Josh Bank or whatever, right? It's really fascinating. Peter McCormick in What Bitcoin did an excellent interview with Jeffrey Snyder. The only thing I disagree with Snyder in was the concept of printing money, but it's a nuanced point. More on that in a second. But if you are,
if you had nuance with Snyder, he would agree with you.
Yeah, that's true. And just be clear, I am.
Or he would prove you wrong. He would either agree with you or prove you wrong.
Yeah, so I'm nowhere on Snyder's level, but this would be my point to Snyder, because Peter McCormick was really trying to understand, what do you mean the Fed's printing money, and Snyder is correct when the Fed doesn't print money. But there's a very important difference in this, in that the Fed can actually create asset swaps. And Snyder made the accurate comment that what the Fed issues, bank reserves, what nobody really wants. And yes, I agree with that, but here's the thing or whatever, right? If the Fed actually wants to get spendable money into the economy, they just have to get the banks to issue a really, really shitty asset. Because let's just say bank reserves are one shitty asset. They only have one level of shittiness. But if banks go through and make a bunch of bad loans, or loans that they will get discharged, think like the PPP loan program during COVID or whatever, right? The Fed can use the commercial banking system as a handmaiden to spin up assets. This is true.
No, the Fed can do that, but they need the intermediary of the government giving them the okay. And that's where Snyder would disagree with you, because the Fed can't do that directly without a third party. And that third party is the government that is funging, that is fungibility saying that this is allowed to happen.
That is true. So I will concede the point.
There's more nuance to the answer. Why, yes, it's true the Fed can do that. They can't unless the government allows them to. And let me say it like this. They can't.
The key point, though, is that the Fed needs a handmaiden and the implicit approval of the government to go through and do it. But that being said, if we look at recent history, the Fed sure doesn't seem to have any problem getting to that. And so while that might be true on paper, functionally, I would say that doesn't, or at least recent experience suggests that it wouldn't exist. One more example, because I know this is really complex and we've gone long. If you're a crypto boy or crypto girl, consider the example of Tether. Tether would be like a synthetic dollar, would it not? And what's more, let's say that you have various large exchanges, fixed exchanges, your Binances, your Coinbases or whatever, right? If you hold Tether or USDC on these exchanges, so you don't hold them in your own wallet, but you hold them on the exchange, you actually have an IOU from whatever the exchange is on the synthetic dollar. And theoretically, if nobody ever were to withdraw their coin, so that is if no one would actually say, well, listen, transfer my Tether to my own private wallet, or transfer my USDC to my own private wallet, or whatever the stable is that you want to play with, mimicking the dollar. This is how the various banks, in this case, the banks would be the exchanges, and the exchanges could issue however many IOU Tethers or IOU USDCs that they could get away with, assuming assuming there was never a collateral call on the system. In this case, it would be users going to the exchange and saying, hey, listen, I don't want you to hold my tethers. I don't want you to hold my USDC. I want to do a withdrawal. But this is the key thing, because in the commercial banking system, you really don't have a functional way to get out of the system, save maybe buying metal or having pallets of cash, but both of those present their own problems. And so what you have, if you want to keep this crypto analogy going, imagine you have a bunch of different crypto exchanges. And you can't, that is us, consumers and businesses or whatever, right? We don't have the ability to withdraw Tether or whatever dollar or whatever synthetic dollar we want to use to our own exchange. And so we have essentially Tether that's being issued by Binance, Tether that's being issued by Coinbase, or USDC that's being issued by Coinbase, or USDC that's being issued by Binance, in the sense that because you can't call the system, you have to trust that the exchange, in this case, the bank, is ultimately good for it. And if the bank can never be called, what's to actually stop the bank from just issuing, a bunch of it? It's a really fascinating thing.
There is no constraint, but we can still see that the banks are not
confidence. Yeah, confidence.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There's not a physical constraint except for the perceived counterparty risk. And we can see since 2008, perceived counterparty risk has been extremely high.
We started off this video asking, how on earth do Eurodollars get spent into the real economy? And the first step I would say in thinking about it is, instead of thinking of Eurodollars, change the name to synthetic dollars. And the second step is that when they actually get spent from, let's say, bank A to bank B, assume that no transaction is actually, here's what will happen. The transaction will be booked. That is, bank A will owe bank B, whatever, or vice versa, but not settled. And as long as banks trust each other.
Not all the time. I mean, that was much more prior to 2008. Now settlement is much more active. I mean, like settlements, I would say, are happening on a daily basis because there's so much perceived counterparty risk. Like that was, I would say, how the system was functioning prior to 2008 when we were running on all 8 cylinders, but we're not running on all 8 cylinders anymore.
So certainly after 2008, the banks might be more skittish of each other, but the large, broad picture remains the same. As long as banks are, I don't want to use the word never, but let's say if banks are slow to actually demand settlement or actually demand netting, or banks will just say net the position together, would say, okay, well, yeah, we are owed $1 trillion by counterparty A, but we also owe counterparty A $1 trillion. So you know what, we're just going to let it ride, because at the end of the day, $1 trillion minus $1 trillion basically takes us back down to zero. And maybe once a quarter, if we have more than, I don't know, numbers out of my backside, more than $100 million in balance, we'll send over some, treasuries or whatever, right?
Well, yes, this is the Eurodollar system for dummies. By no means is this a simple.
Oh, yeah, it's for dummies, by dummies. Just to be clear, for dummies, by dummies.
It's just not a simple thing. I mean, like the Eurodollar system is not simple for a reason, or everybody would understand it. And we don't even understand it to an extremely high degree. We are simply trying to put the pieces of the puzzle together. Thank you, and we'll see you on the next one.
There.